I'm officially recording now. So we're excited to share with you at the beginning of this year, a collaboration was created with our partners, Chloe from the Children's Immigration Law Academy, Marissa with Justice for Our Neighbors in Houston, Rosalie Hyde with the Houston Galveston Trauma Institute, and Jessica Houghton with Tahirih Justice Center here in Houston, to bring you a web series for attorneys by mental health clinicians and immigration attorneys to address best practices in working with traumatized clients, mental health, and forensic evaluations for immigration cases. This webinar series will cover trauma-informed lawyering, how and why to use forensic evaluations, creating a collaboration with mental health clinicians, court prep, testimony, and much more. We are excited to kick off the first webinar of this series titled From Trauma to Resilience, Learning a Client's Story from a Trauma-Informed Lens. Today's presentation is led by Rosalie Hyde and Jessica Houghton, and I will let them introduce themselves.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Missy mentioned, my name is Jessica Houghton, and I'm the managing attorney at the Tahirih Justice Center. The mission of the Tahirih Justice Center is to work with immigrant survivors of violence, immigrant survivors of gender-based violence, as they seek protection under U.S. law. I'm here today presenting with Rosalie. I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, everybody. I hope this can be really meaningful for all of us here, and we're really glad you're here. I'm a psychotherapist, a social worker in private practice for over 30 years with a subspecialty in traumatic life experience and its impact on mental health and interpersonal relationships. So I'm also faculty in a small training institute with 3 other mental health clinicians to train mental health professionals and others about the impact of trauma on mental health. And I've been trained by Physicians for Human Rights and been doing forensic evaluation since 2001 for immigration court.
As Nassim mentioned, this first presentation is part of a series, but we figured we couldn't really talk about how to use forensics in your cases and how to incorporate it and what the legal strategy is if we didn't first establish a basic understanding of what is trauma. And not only that, but how you as the attorney or the advocate can work with your client in the most trauma-informed way possible. And so that's the focus of this presentation. I think we're going to start though with a poll, and let's get an idea of who's with us today. So if everyone can just answer, and we'll get an idea of who's here.
Yeah, we'd like to know. And while you're answering, we also hope that you're really thinking about what we're talking about and willing to, I think we chat with the questions, and Nassim's going to be monitoring those things. So, and we may have to talk louder, so also let us know if there's a technological problem that you're experiencing that we don't know about. Is that better? Okay.
All right, Nassim, do we have some results coming in? Here we go. So it looks like over half of the people here today are nonprofit attorneys, so thank you. And then we also have a good representation from private attorneys as well as the ever important advocates and social workers. So thank you everyone for joining us today. The other thing I'd like to note is that Nassim will be monitoring the chat box. So if you have questions, please do put them in the chat box and we'll keep a running tally. What we're going to do is pause after every section and look and see what questions we have and take a few questions as we go. However, we're trying to reserve some time at the end for questions as well. So if we don't get to your question during the presentation, feel free to please pop it back in at the end and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as possible. It's a lot of information to cover, but here we go. So let's get started. And so, as I mentioned before, the goals of this presentation, this is what we're trying to do, is talk about trauma and get a fundamental understanding of what is trauma. We're going to then move into the impact trauma has on the everyday lives of survivors of violence. From there, we're going to talk about different tips and tricks of how to lawyer from a trauma-informed lens. And lastly, we'd be remiss to at least not mention and talk about vicarious trauma and self-care, because working with trauma survivors also affects you, the advocate.
So just to start, we're going to have a broad spectrum understanding of the definition of trauma. And this is one of my favorites. The experience associated with an event, one event or an ongoing condition in which the person's ability to manage their feelings is overwhelmed. Managing one's feelings is overwhelmed, and the person feels that his or her life is being threatened or that their body is being threatened. So that in layperson's terms, of course, we want to understand that the central problem is managing overwhelm. So anyway, that being said, where do we go from here? Types of trauma. These are very complicated. It's a complicated landscape for the impact of trauma, but to just think about various forms and degrees of trauma. So acute trauma, of course, is a one incident. It can be very, very severe, but it's a one incident trauma. Repetitive trauma, of course, is the obvious, and it can be repetitive, the same exact experience over and over again. Complex trauma is generally many experiences of different kinds of trauma over time in a chronic way. And of course, there's historical trauma in the family, in the culture, in one's race, in one's gender. So victims of chronic trauma, for example, domestic violence, incest, child abuse, are deprived of any kind of supportive, ameliorating environment in which the trauma occurs and in which they can recover. The chronicity of abuse leads to very big experiences of internalized shame and the experience of numbing and avoidance and feeling either numb or overwhelmed by emotions, and leaves the person, the victim, unable to protect and advocate for themselves. And this is very, very important, particularly for you all who are the advocates. The accumulation of problems and difficulties creates both a chronic and complex interpersonal scene, particularly for people who have had multiple experiences of trauma or abuse and victimization at the hands of another person.
What this means in your cases, as an attorney or an advocate, is the fact that your client might be presenting with multiple different forms of trauma. For example, the client that you're working with, if they're seeking asylum, might have been a victim of childhood abuse. And then they were in a domestic violence relationship. And then something might have happened to them on the way to the United States. And then here in the United States, they could have been re-victimized. Just in that, we've talked about repetitive or chronic trauma, as well as complex trauma, because there's the ongoing abuse and one type of abuse, as well as different types of abuse in their life, in their story. And then, for example, if they came to Houston in time for Hurricane Harvey, not only do we have interpersonal violence, but we also have the environmental trauma of that as well.
And also to remember that, and I'll get to the next slide, that the central problem with trauma is fear, right? Fear for one's life. One is never safe. And so many of your clients are not safe yet if they're applying. So just to remember that in the absence of complete safety, they're going to be much more symptomatic. So the extra burden survivors face is this interpersonal violence tends to be more traumatic than, of course, other kinds of violence like natural disasters. It's more disruptive to our fundamental experience of a sense of trust, of course, safety, and attachments, secure attachments to others, particularly in intimate relationships. And it's typically experienced as intentional rather than some kind of accident of nature. This is very important with your clients. So another piece that's very important is the issue of gender, particularly with the wave of many women and children coming in during this most recent period of time. Women are disproportionately affected by physical and sexual violence. They also have less access to asylum across the globe. This is very important to understand. And the prevalence of PTSD is twice as high in women as in men. Women are exposed to trauma are 4 times as likely to develop PTSD. All right, social, political, cultural, economic situations, in addition to access to healthcare, often interact in ways that negatively impact women and the severity of their symptom profiles. And women of color are additionally affected by racial trauma, which can result from experiences of racism in other aspects of their lives, at work or in other more subtle, everyday experiences that erode their self-capacities, which I'm going to talk a little bit about later. So this is an important slide. And anybody who, a mental health person who understands trauma, really tries to help people understand the original story is housed in the experience of a victim at the hands of another person who's perpetrating or abusing them, and the long for rescuer that is always present when one is being hurt and terrified. So in this triangle, as you can see, at the end where the witness rescuer angle is, there is often, in the original experience that your clients have or that any one of us has, there is often a colluding witness. Let's say the grandmother in El Salvador has this child and the mother is gone and in the US. And the grandmother colludes by really letting and understanding that the uncle is abusing the girl. That's long before she ever shows up here. Or there can be a powerless witness as well in this experience, in the original experience, and that's a person who knows it's happening but can't do anything about it. And we can often end up feeling either like the powerless witness when we're trying to help people in such dire circumstances, or the colluding witness when we really are part of a system that is not necessarily always the rescuer that is longed for. So I would like you to consider going back to this slide over and over again in the course of your work, and it will be more meaningful as you begin to experience yourself sometimes feeling powerless or colluding, or even hurting them when you don't want to.
I think, Rosalie, you make a great point about going back to the slide. As the attorney, you're also going to be able to now see how this plays out at different times in your client's story. For example, if your client was a victim of child abuse or had an unsafe home, and then she met her partner, who in the beginning seemed like he was kind and sweet and provided safety that she did not have at home. That person to her seems like a rescuer. He's coming in with her as the victim at the top of the triangle and him as the rescuer. And if that relationship later on sours and he becomes an abuser, we have that rescuer moving into the perpetrator position. So that's a dynamic that comes through in your client's story, or could come through in your client's story in a variety of ways, with different players playing different roles. It can also be true, though, in our system. And so by understanding this triangle, it helps us to better prepare our clients. For example, there are times when the U.S. immigration system to our clients can seem like the rescuer. They're coming to access protection so that they're no longer facing persecution. And yet we all know, especially those of us who do this work every day, that it is an incredibly traumatic and incredibly difficult system. And so what first seemed like hope can seem instead a form of punishment. And so a judge who seems like the person who could be the one to provide protection and is instead questioning them and putting them through an incredibly traumatic process goes from rescuer to perpetrator. And by understanding this, that allows us to prepare our clients better for what comes. Because if this is how they view the system, that helps perpetuate the traumatic experience of it. So if we know that that's a dynamic that might happen, we can explain to them the process and prepare them for that process and make sure that they have the tools and tips and tricks that they need to be able to navigate a traumatic process in the most trauma-informed way possible.
Yeah, and later we're going to talk a little bit about reenactment and as one of the outcomes with people who have chronic, severe trauma over their lifespan. So, and reenactment is of that original triangle. the original story over and over again playing out in their lives, and oftentimes because we are with them and trying to help them with us as well. So, okay, this slide is very important also because it's one of the things that mental health professionals and others, we just fail to think about too much. But many of our clients have had some kind of closed head traumatic brain injury and head trauma, particularly when we're talking about people who have experienced lots of physical violence, whether it's domestic violence or some other kind of torture in the traditional sense of asylum law. And we want to be able to ask about these traumatic brain injury. But first, we have to understand that it increases the risk for both PTSD and depression over the lifespan. Often, they do not exhibit gross neurological signs as someone who has had a stroke or someone who has had some kind of serious brain injury, open head brain injury, like those that, but even there's TBIs that do have neurological signs, but most of our clients don't. Most frequent symptoms include headaches, dizziness, problems with concentration and memory. So obviously concentration and memory is going to affect them and the way they do the case for you. The increased risk for slow mental processing, impairments in attention, and executive functions like multitasking, dividing and sustaining attention, and maintaining kind of a motivation and engagement in their own environment. This affects how they can do the case and how they can give you a report. Behaviors such as apathy, impulse control problems, distractibility, and poorly regulated emotions. They already have an emotion regulation problem if they've been traumatized. And now the TBI on top of it increases that. So it increases irritability, and behavioral outbursts are sometimes associated with TBI. So you want to ask about head injuries, about blacking out, things like that if they've been physically abused.
So as the attorney or advocate, what this means for you is by knowing about the possible effects of traumatic head or brain injury, that means that we can make referrals that we need to make. It also means that there's a potential expert, medical expert out there that may help you document the abuse or persecution that your client has suffered. It also helps us know what our client might be experiencing and that there's a cause for it. And these are all things that we can include in the declaration and help frame for the court to understand about what our client is going through. And that's something that we'll touch on more, those strategies and how to incorporate all of this into your case in later web series. Are there any questions about trauma itself before we move forward, Nassim, that we should pause for?
No questions yet in the chat box, but this is your moment. And if you're on the phone, do know that you have been muted. And so you can unmute yourself and ask a question if you're not on your computer.
Yeah, my experience with attorneys is that they hesitate to ask questions, but it's really a good opportunity for the dialogue, because I think this is a real chance for expanding and deepening our ability to convey this information. So whatever questions you might have, we really welcome them.
So let's transition into the impact that trauma has on a survivor of violence.
So first, it's very important to understand, and most people don't, that PTSD and other forms of chronic trauma are a physical illness. The brain has been affected, which affects the body. So it is a physical illness at its core. It impacts the survivor's memory, both ability to recall and the ability to have the memory be, just to have memory, period, and to have it to be accurate or in chronological order. Trauma impacts the ability to make decisions and executive function and analytical thinking, because it is the brain that is affected. Trauma affects how he or she perceives and interacts with others. So this is pretty global, pretty broad spectrum impact on a person's life and their ability to work through their case.
And at the end of the day, the reason why we're having this training series for attorneys and for different advocates is that understanding makes you a better advocate and an attorney for your client. It helps you ask the right questions, frame them the right way, and truly present to the court or whoever is the adjudicator in your client's case a better picture of what your client has gone through and the impact that has had on their lives.
So this, I'm not a neurobiologist, but there is a great deal of research about the impact of chronic complex trauma. Some patients we call complex PTSD, most of the ones that certainly Tahirih works with, that is true of. But the brain is changed. And in these pictures, you can see the impact of trauma on the left where the areas of the brain are shrunken, and the healthier brain where all the activated areas are working well. There's a particular area of the brain that shrinks with chronic trauma. It's called the hippocampus. This also impacts how and where memory is housed in the brain. Traumatic memory is housed in an emotional amygdala-based area of the brain, not in the frontal cortex where our non-trauma memory is, our declarative memory. So this is just to help you really see that it's a physical brain problem. But the good news is that with good treatment, people get better and the hippocampus expands again. So we know that with imaging as well. So one of the important things with regard to their case is to understand how survivors of violence have problems recalling accurate memories. So in reporting to you. So these are the different ways that trauma memory can and does emerge, right? So there can be continuously, clearly remembered with corroborative evidence. So they are continuous in time and they're remembered and somebody else validates that. But however, much of trauma memory, in fact, we know the data about people who have been sexually abused, is delayed. In other words, that people have years of not remembering. And it is fragmentary memory. It comes in fragments. It is not continuous and not housed in time. But it can be corroborated, some of those delayed and fragmentary memories, by a sibling or a parent or someone, right? Or even the law or police reports. Hospital reports, for example, in our country about incest and sexual abuse. Then there is continuously, clearly remembered without corroboration. No one was there, no one corroborates, but they understand, remember, and can report in chronological time. Then there's the delayed fragmentary memory without corroboration. There's exaggerated, distorted memories. And this is just a part of the nature of traumatic memory, that it's not always exactly as it happened because of the nature of child development, of the nature of what happens to a child, particularly children, but even to adults, because trauma memory is so emotional in general and housed in the emotional part of the brain. And there are other aspects that create memories that might be distorted in some way. There are false memories, they do exist. And some of them are patient constructed, not necessarily out of some intentional willingness to lie, but because the brain actually is so open, so suggestive, and something important and bad happened to this person. And their mind can kind of create a memory that makes some sense to them. And then there's these suggested false memory, outsider suggestions, because most of our clients who are chronically traumatized are open in memories that in ways that are neurologically and psychosocially based. They are suggestible. So we want to be very careful with how we ask questions so that we don't suggest. We are open to answers and we ask open-ended questions. We'll talk more about that later on in the series.
And given that our immigration system expects a client to be able to present their entire story from beginning to end in chronological order, with exact dates when possible, and in extreme detail, we see the uphill battle that you as the attorney can have. But the reason why it's important to understand, particularly the effect that memory and trauma has on memory, is that it's our job to make sure the adjudicator of the case understands and to get into the record in whatever way possible information about trauma. Because unfortunately, you're more the expert on trauma than the person making a decision on the case. And the judges in our country, our communities, the general population do not understand trauma and mental health. And so it is on us as the advocate to make sure the impact the trauma has on our client's memory is in the record, whether for appeal or just for the judge's decision. Because consistency, unfortunately, is part of the decision about credibility. And we don't want a detail that wasn't remembered before because of the trauma that our client suffered to be one of the reasons the judge finds your client not credible. But if we frame it for the judge about the impact of memory, then we have an explanation other than the idea that the client is lying.
So that's also why it can be helpful, and we're going to talk more about that later in the series, that why a really good trauma-based understanding forensic is helpful, because the forensic can explain some of these inconsistencies with regard to trauma and memory recovery, right? And we can also use a forensic evaluator or an expert witness, somebody who really knows something about trauma and the brain and memory, to explain that to the court when they might not otherwise understand it and might in fact question the integrity of the client.
And this information really actually helps not just in presenting your case, but when working with your client. It allows you to think about maybe building in times that you can have opportunities to meet with your clients at different stages, because they might remember something that day that they didn't remember before. It plays into the strategy, and we'll talk about this in future webinars, about when you're even submitting an affidavit to a judge or an adjudicator. But it also allows you to help keep this in mind when you're working with your client. I'm sure a lot of people who are logged onto this webinar have had moments when they've been working with somebody for 3+ years. They think they know every single aspect of their story, and all of a sudden they pop out with a detail that you're pretty sure you had asked about at some point during those 3 years that was completely relevant to the case, and they present it as something obviously that they must have told you before and you know you've never heard. And by understanding trauma, you understand why this is happening and that this can happen, and it just makes the whole process a little bit easier, because you can be also just yourself mentally prepared for this being a reality in the work that we do.
So, and what's I think pretty important to understand, that as you are trying to get the story from them, in however many, hopefully, opportunities of meeting with them that you can, to develop some approximation of safety, those delayed memories may come more because they're talking about it. So when they enter into some kind of exploratory experience of trying to remember, things come to them that they may have never remembered. And it's also possible they forget it again, even after they told you. And you want to understand that that's the nature of trauma memory. So, okay, so I want to this is an important slide because it really kind of just gives you that profound understanding of the profound effect on all aspects of a person's life. And we really want you to understand this. So we're going to just start with loss of self-worth, right? Especially with people who've had this long, they probably had some history in childhood, even if it was only poverty. And then you have these horrific events, and then you have migration trauma, and you have horrible things that have happened to people, and now they're not safe because they're not safe. We all know that. So the loss of self-worth is so central, so central. And when people are traumatized physically and sexually and humiliated in childhood by people that are supposed to take care of them, or authority figures that are supposed to protect them. There's a chipping away of a sense of positive self-regard over time, right? A sense that I am a valuable person. And this is going to affect them behaviorally in their ability to protect themselves or even speak up about themselves, which when you're asking about what their story is, this inhibits their capacity. And it's not a conscious awareness. It's, they're not aware that this is a problem. So the loss of sense of self, right? One of the roles of the primary attachment figure or caregiver is to help us discover how we feel and who we are, and learning how to reflect on that. So the sense of I is definitely traumatized, even when, especially when it's in childhood. And we can talk more about that later. Okay, loss of physical connection to the body. I'm going to talk about dissociation also, and I'm going to run through the slide, which I don't like, but we're going to try. Dissociation is the central primary defense against that any one of us would have, some form of dissociating out of our awareness some aspect of experience. Or it can be all parts of an experience so that we have no memory of it. But there are multiple aspects of any one experience: behavior, feelings, sensation, and the knowledge of what happened. Any part of that can be gone, or all parts and just one be there. So this is a defense that allows us to keep going, and these people are surviving because of dissociation. But it also can inhibit the connection to one's body that's been violated and violated repeatedly over time. So, okay, hopefully we can talk more about that later in the forensic times. But the loss of intimacy, the loss of the ability to be sexual, particularly when there's been multiple sexual abuses or violent rapes. Of course, this is going to affect interpersonal ability to trust and be intimate physically. So shame, huge. They internalize shame. When they're the victim, their overwhelming, debilitating shame takes over, particularly when it starts in childhood. And many of our clients, you know, were 13 and 14 years old when these abusive relationships began, and they're considered to have been an adult in some cultural way, right? The child may grow into an adult who cannot bear to be in the wrong or feels always wrong because of it. So loss of trust, loss of danger cues. They are repeatedly abused over their lifespan because their radar for who's safe and who's dangerous is not there as we would understand it. Their radar is for abusers in a way because of their history. This is a very complex psychosocial interpersonal attachment problem. But so you'll see repeated reenactments, that's the top, reenactments of being abused, of finding abusers, because that's the nature of that original trauma triangle that gets replayed and replayed in their lives.
There's only two quick points that I want to make about this slide for you as the attorney or advocate. Don't be afraid to use this slide to get ideas when you're formulating a client statement or declaration. Mm-hmm. It allows you to get ideas of things that you should ask about. How do you feel? How do you feel about getting into another relationship? Or how do you feel about yourself, right? These are things that you can incorporate into the story to make that connection between what happened to them and how they feel and how that is a manifestation of trauma. And your job as the attorney is to connect all of those dots for the adjudicator. This is what the effect of trauma is. This is what happened to my client. And this is how they say they feel now. This tool, especially when combined with things like the immigrant power and control wheel, will help make sure that you are thinking of your client's story in the big picture way.
Right. And so you also want your forensic evaluators to be able to discuss these issues beyond, and we'll talk about that, beyond just diagnoses, because these are the things that really impact what the court seems to question. Is that right?
Right. And And then the last thing to think about, again, maybe taking a step back from being the attorney, the last thing to think about is what Rosalie mentioned earlier, this concept of being the sitting duck. Loss of danger cues is incredibly important. Just because they've made it to the United States doesn't mean there is any sense of safety, as Rosalie mentioned, especially given how long immigration cases can take. There is not a moment where things have now become safe. They're still in the process, especially when working with us on their case, of reliving the past and reliving the trauma. And unfortunately, at least at Tahirih, we see a large number of our clients, despite having connections to social services, who end up being re-victimized because that sense of safety has not been established yet. So that is something that even away from their case, as an advocate, it is something to consider and think about when you're providing support and referrals and working with them throughout the life of the case.
And this is their vulnerability to reenactment, as we saw in the slide prior to this. And it is this whole notion of the sitting duck is a notion that comes right out of the work of an expert in the work of in the world of trauma and dissociation in mental health. It's true for most people who have been repeatedly traumatized that they will be vulnerable to that repetition over and over again, and that's why we refer them for treatment. So yeah, we can talk more about that later.
Sure. Nassim, any questions before we move on to the next section?
We might. Is your volume up?
My volume?
Yeah, I think Brenda has a. Brenda, hold on 1 second.
No, it's not. I'm
Brenda, do you want to ask your question? Did you have a question?
No. I'm fine. I'm sorry.
Okay, hold on, guys. Now we can. All right.
Okay.
I saw somebody get off mute. Does anyone on the phone have a question before we move on? You can unmute yourself.
Can you hear us? Can you hear me now? I feel like I'm a commercial. All right.
Where are we? Where can they see it?
Yeah. So, all right. I think we've got it now, guys. So now we've talked about what is trauma. We've talked about how it impacts our clients. It's time to apply it as the attorney. So we're going to move into trauma-informed lawyering. And so why are we even talking about it? And what is trauma-informed lawyering? The goals of trauma-informed lawyering is to avoid re-victimization. Thinking back to Rosalie's trauma triangle that we talked about, and the fact that sometimes we're the witness, if we're not careful in the way we frame questions, we can also move a little bit into that perpetrator stance, right? It can be very difficult for a client. Maybe not can be, it is very difficult for any survivor to recount their story over and over again. And I cannot stress enough, our immigration system is a traumatic system. And so our goal is to the best of our ability, be as trauma-informed in that traumatic system. And so we're aiming to avoid re-victimizing our clients. It helps us as attorneys and as advocates to understand the different behaviors our clients might present with. Like I mentioned, the idea of remembering a part of their story years later. By understanding that, we can prepare for that to the best of our ability and understand it when it happens. Being trauma-informed means that we're trying to maximize the choices our clients have. As survivors, oftentimes they've been violated in multiple ways. And with that, their sense of autonomy, their sense of self, and their ability to make choices for themselves have been stripped from them. And so being trauma-informed means that we are doing our best to give back that autonomy and give as many choices as we can give in the aspects of our role, right? There's nothing we can do about a deadline, but we can explain that and give choices where we're able to give them. Being trauma-informed means that we're seeking to be culturally humble. It means that we're culturally competent in understanding the impact that culture has on our clients. And we're humble enough to know that people come from different perspectives, different religions, different languages, and that impacts every aspect of our lives, whether we are a survivor or not. And along with that, it seeks to understand that context and the individual nature that survivors come to us when we work on their case. And so our goal is to be as trauma-informed in this process as possible and to lawyer from that perspective. And so let's talk about just framing the whole message. Essentially what that means is we want to frame the work we're doing, not from a perspective of what is wrong with you, what is wrong with that client, what is wrong with that survivor, but to talk about instead what happened to them. And so even changing that perspective and that framing helps us to be more trauma-informed.
And that is also our goal, is to teach the court that it's not what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them. But that's connected to the whole purpose that we're doing this for.
I don't know how many of you have had a government attorney or a judge ask the client, but why didn't you leave? Or why didn't you do this? And we see our client deflate right there on the stand, no matter how much we try to prepare them for it. And that's part of our job, is to help frame it. It's not that they did something wrong, it's something that happened to them, and it ties into the physical effect that trauma has had on their lives, and connecting all the dots of our understanding of trauma and what is trauma to the choices and story of our client.
And there's another concept that we didn't talk about earlier that I think is important just to mention, that you have a notion about what something's called learned helplessness. And in many of the most recent wave of chronically traumatized, many times women who have been in abusive relationships, isolated for many, many years, sometimes, over-controlled, over-monitored, humiliated. There is a phenomenon that human beings experience that is about, even when you're free to leave, if you were in fact free to leave, you can't. And that answers some of the questions about why did a person leave.
I know, thanks to our poll, that over half of the people on this call are nonprofit attorneys. And I know for some of you, you may already have a practice and different tips and tricks that you use to be trauma-informed, and that you have a basic understanding or some understanding of trauma and how it impacts your clients. And so my hope is that even if this is part of your normal practice, this could be a helpful reminder of different options you have, and also a call to be very intentional. I think sometimes those of us who've been doing this for a while do things out of habit. We ask the right questions, but we don't remember that the reason why we're doing it is because we want to be trauma-informed. So this is an opportunity for us to reflect on our practices, to make sure we're being intentional about the choices to be trauma-informed, and also to remind us of the different things that we can help teach others to do. If we're a mentor, if we have interns, if we're working with pro bono attorneys, this is an opportunity to make sure that we are passing on that knowledge that we've gained through sometimes making a lot of mistakes, to help others as they navigate the relationship with working with survivors of violence. And so being a trauma-informed lawyer really is something that starts from beginning to end. The idea is that that's not something that just happens during the meeting with your client, but it comes from a practice and a thought and an intent that happens even before the client walks in your door. And so what we're going to do is focus on that first call to set up a meeting with a client, the meeting itself, and then we're going to talk a little bit about tips and tricks to get a client's story and deal with potential memory issues that might result from trauma.
But the trauma-informed lawyering is a partnership. That notion that you are creating for this client for maybe the very first time in their lives that someone is actually thinking about them in some kind of collaborative way with equal power and equal value. And they're not used to that, so it takes a while for them to really believe that you are in a partnership working on your case. And that's part of creating safety, at least in the room with you.
It's a great point, Rosalie. And by approaching it as a partnership, it also helps keep in mind how our clients might view us. Sometimes we don't feel it, especially when we're losing cases in court and we feel like nothing is going our way. But at the end of the day, you are in a position of power to your client. And if you approach this as a partnership, as a collaboration, it helps keep that in mind, that you're working with your client because it's your client's story and it's your client's case. And they should be as informed as possible throughout the entire process.
And because of their history with authority figures, whether it was a parent or a relative or the police or, you know, anyone in authority is frightening to them. And particularly now when they're feeling not safe and they don't know if they're going to be allowed to stay, you are authority that in fact is frightening to them. So it takes a while to develop some real idea that you are there to help them.
So let's talk about scheduling a call, scheduling that meeting with your client. When scheduling your meeting, there are ways to think about the who, the what, the where, and the when doing that. So let's start with who. When you're on the phone with your client, it's important to just remind them who you are. Oftentimes survivors, at least I find for my clients, are not going to answer the call with a number that they don't know. Again, this goes back to the whole not safe feeling. And so remind them of who you are when you're calling. It's also important to let them know who's going to be at the meeting when you have them there. We all know how intimidating it is to walk in and all of a sudden think you're going to talk to 1 or 2 people and there's 5 people in the room. It's exactly the same for our clients. So let them know they're going to meet with you and also going to meet with your paralegal, and that there may be an interpreter in the room if that is your situation. Don't forget the what. Let them know what the purpose of the call is. I'm calling to schedule a meeting with you to fill out the forms for your asylum application. Talking again about your trauma story is incredibly difficult. And if they know they're meeting with you in 2 weeks and they don't know what about, obviously it's human nature. We're going to think of worst case scenario. And so you don't want your client thinking when you're actually just going to meet with them to talk about biographical information, that they're going to be sharing a horrible part of the story that they're not looking forward to sharing, and instead spending 2 weeks leading up to that meeting stressed out and worried. That means they're going to walk through the door already not in a good place, and it is not going to be as productive as a meeting as it could be. Keep in mind the logistics. Again, sometimes this goes back to being culturally humble. Parking can be very difficult. Reminding them of what floor you're meeting with them at. Keep in mind the potential barriers, whether they come from culture or from socioeconomic issues or from trauma. As we've mentioned, giving autonomy and choice back to your client is incredibly important. That goes to the when. If you're coming up with a time that only works for you, there's possibility that your client is just going to agree because they appreciate the fact that you're providing them a service, and then they're going to have to cancel later, which doesn't do anything for your calendar or for theirs. Ask them, do you prefer morning or afternoon? Ask them if there's a certain day of the week that works best for them. Obviously, there are limitations between your schedule and we're all busy or whatever deadline you have coming up, but to the best of your ability, collaborate with your client about when would be a good time to set that meeting. Additionally, let them know about how long the meeting will take. They have other things to worry about in addition to their case, including sometimes childcare, taking the bus, organizing a ride. So let them know at the time of scheduling the meeting how long the meeting will take. And again, let them know why. Let them know why you want to meet with them and also what the goals of that meeting are. You're already setting yourself up for success then, because when you achieve those goals, there's a sense of accomplishment as well. And so let them know, again, the purpose of that meeting. And so this way you're communicating your client, you're reinforcing what you're working on, and you're partnering with your client by keeping them informed of what's going on.
So you don't want to make assumptions. The details are very important because these are people coming from cultures we don't understand and may have no understanding of what this process is about at all. So what you might think is so basic and assumed about the purpose of the meeting or what we're going to talk about or who you are even, is not necessarily assumed by the client. So you want to give the details of information in a way that you might, with an American person, you wouldn't even need to think about.
But even Rosalie, working with survivors who might come from America also have so many different issues that they're dealing with, and we've already talked about the impact trauma has. So our job is to try to make it as easy as possible, right? So these are also helpful tips and tricks when working with any survivor.
Right, like if you're lawyers who are out there doing family law, for example, or doing criminal law, you're also working with trauma.
Let's move into now, after you've scheduled your meeting, to how to structure the meeting itself. And before I forget, we all learn in different ways, and this is a lot of information that we're talking through. Not only will you get this PowerPoint afterwards, but we also have several role-playing videos featuring Chloe and Marissa and Nassim to help reinforce some of the do's and don'ts when working with your clients. And so if you want a reminder, if you want a refresher, you want to see some great acting, watch the role-playing videos because it'll help reinforce these different tips and techniques that we are talking about in this video. And so now you've scheduled a meeting with your client and you've built in time maybe for a reminder because we've already talked about how trauma affects the memory of our clients. So we've reminded our client of the meeting that we have coming up. One way to think about structuring your meeting with your client is that it should have a beginning, a middle, and an end. For the beginning, when you're meeting with your client, that's the time where you're building rapport. You're asking them to come in. You're giving them choices that we talked about. Where would you like to sit? And that one is actually really important because some individuals and some survivors feel uncomfortable with having, for example, a door behind them. And if you've had your clients sit with a door behind them, and that is something for them that is personally triggering, now the entire time during the meeting, they're going to be looking behind them and not necessarily present and focused into the meeting itself. Is it something that can't be overcome? Of course not. No, it's still a meeting and you're still going to get great information. But this goes to different little things that we can do to make it as trauma-informed and client-centered as possible.
Because remember, they're already anxious. They can't, and the central to the affect regulation or feeling regulation problem with the brain is that they can't calm themselves down easily. So what otherwise might be something they could get used to easily, these small ways that would make them safe, they sit near or far from you, they sit by the door, away from the door, helps with them being able not to get so hyper aroused they can't think while they're talking to you.
And sometimes we treat small talk as just something we do to pass the time while we're about to do what's really important. What we're trying to challenge people to think about is the fact that this is important. The small talk is important. It's helping to foster the safe environment and build rapport and trust with your client. And remember, the loss of trust is a noted result of the impact of trauma has on survivors. It's important then to transition into working on your case. So now we're going to talk about your story so that we can build your affidavit, which is something we're submitting along with your asylum application for your case. Again, you're reinforcing what is going on. You're keeping them informed about their case and also helping to transition from discussing things about the present to the fact that you're about to talk about the past and things that happened to them.
Which is what they want to avoid at all costs, consciously and unconsciously, because they get so hyper-aroused or so numb.
And that also helps frame the meeting. Again, I know you did that on the phone, but you're helping now to set the goals of the meeting and why. And using that to inform the client of expectations. So during the meeting, you're now achieving those goals that you've set out both on the phone and in your transition. And in a later slide, we'll talk about different kind of tips that you can use to make that meeting as trauma-informed as possible. Then you have the end of your meeting. And again, it's just as important as the beginning. Throughout your meeting with your client, and especially at the end, remember to validate. Validate the feelings that have just been shared with you. As we've mentioned, and as we all know, it is difficult to share things that bring us shame, and things that oftentimes our clients have spent years trying to hide. So thank you for sharing that with me. I can only imagine how hard it was, and I appreciate you doing that. These things are important. It helps, again, build that relationship with your clients. Not only that, is that we've just taken your client to the past and had them focus on the past. And it is important to make sure our client leaves our office in the best place possible. And that place is in the present. So it's reminding them of that they're currently safe, and bringing them back by asking, so how do you plan to get home? Or what do you plan to do when you get home? Do you have plans for dinner? How are you feeling? This meeting was hard. Thank you again for sharing everything about your story with me. What are you going to do to take care of yourself tonight? You're encouraging your clients to think and value and put importance to that self-care that we all need to be focusing on, and also having them focus on the today and the present.
But they don't really understand what self-care is. I mean, people who have been profoundly neglected their whole lives have no idea what that means. So you have to ask things like, well, what would feel good? What feels good to you? What kind, is it music? Do you like to pet your dog? Can you play with your children? Can you make a good meal tonight? Don't watch any TV that is violent or disruptive. Maybe there's some fun TV or comedy you can watch. You want to give them examples, make a list before they leave of what they're going to do that night. And you say, sometimes people have trouble after they've talked about it, and we want you to do the very best you can and enjoy this evening so you can sleep better tonight.
And one of the reasons we say we didn't, engage in that conversation is just because we ran out of time. One of the ways we're trying to get people to think about it in terms of structuring a meeting this way, where you have that beginning, that middle, and that end, is that you've budgeted time specifically for that. Mm-hmm. So if you're running out of time in your meeting, make sure that you end with enough time to have a proper wrap up. Also talk about next steps. I'm going to use the information gathered today to write your declaration. I will call you in a couple of weeks to set our next meeting. Let them know what the next steps are in their case.
Because nobody has ever, they could not rely on anything. Everything was unpredictable. For you to start giving them information about what's going to happen next, then I'm going to call you, et cetera, it's building that safety in the relationship, and you're going to get more information later because of that.
So let's talk about different tips and tricks during that meeting. Be clear about the information you need, and why you need it. And so one of the reasons I say this is that you're going to work with clients who present in a lot of different ways. For some clients, getting information from them is maybe yes, no. How did
one syllable answers?
How did he treat you? Bad. How did it make you feel? Sad. You feel almost like you're in a Dr. Seuss book. And so that's one client. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have clients that when you ask, tell me about your birthday. Well, on Christmas, this happened, and then this happened, and then 5 years before that, this happened, and then this awful thing, this awful thing, this awful thing. And you're like, I just wanted to ask about their birthday. I just needed to confirm the date.
And they might tell you things in different times in their life, and you can't make the connections because they're like, all over the place in terms of time. And you're trying to ground them in some kind of story of their life.
And so while it can be challenging to try to figure out how to redirect a client or how to focus a client, it's an important thing to know that you can and should do. Give space for your client to talk. Let them own their own story and share, but don't make them overshare if you don't need that information. If you know you're going to have to talk about the sexual assault that they suffered at some point later on, don't let them tell it to you now when you want to confirm biographical information. It doesn't do you any good to hear it again, and it sure doesn't do anything for your client to have to share it more than she needs to. And so you feel free to appropriately interrupt and say, thank you so much for sharing that with me. I know it is hard to share, but right now, as I mentioned, I want to focus on making sure I have this information right that I need for this reason. So let's focus on that so that I can make sure I'm telling it in your story exactly right.
Yeah, and redirecting them back to, so you do the hard stuff later, and you start with the easy demographics and the present day and what's going on now, so that you're not getting them all hyper-aroused and they can't think before you get to the important part of the story that relates to the case, correct?
And sometimes that is out of your control, but at the end of the day, if you know you need a certain piece of information, even if you are talking about the hard stuff, and right now you're trying to focus on the relationship that they had that may have been abusive, and they are trying to tell you about the child abuse, it is okay to redirect, but explain why.
Yes.
Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm so sorry that happened to you. I need to focus right now on, and I'm asking you about this relationship because I want to make sure the judge understands how this fits into your case. It seems like a simple thing to say, have tissues. The tissue box can be an incredible tool to build rapport and connection. It seems silly, but offering somebody a tissue is a way to say also, I see you, I hear you, I know this is hard. It builds a connection. It also allows you to take a little break from saying what you were saying. It gives an action and a reaction that is appropriate and comforting to something that was just shared. Along with that, be aware of body language. If you notice that your client is starting to rock, is starting to look away, it is starting to get flustered, that may be a great time to take a break. And I don't mean take a break, and I know the next point means offer breaks. So along with that, it may be a great time to take a break, not immediately. If the client just says something about being abused and your response is to, well, okay, so let's take a break, is not always the most effective way to do that. So there are ways to do that with transition. Again, it goes back to validating. Thank you so much for sharing that with me. Would you like to take a break? Or we can take a break if you would like. Again, you're giving choices and you're also validating.
And you can slow down now. Why don't you just take some deep, long breaths? Because those breaths can help get their brain back to safe brain, rather than the hyper-aroused, oversensitized brain they're in. And you're noticing it with their body language, with their behavior, and their eye contact.
The body language that is important is not just that of your clients, though. It's also your body language as well. So be aware of the way your face is responding, the way you're leaning. If a client is saying something to you and you're kind of leaning back, it's all stuff that your client's going to be picking up on. So be aware of your body language as well.
And your facial expressions.
And you
said the other day, right?
So, and also be aware of how you take notes. If your face is buried in your computer and you're not making eye contact with your client, you're losing the ability to, one, be aware of their body language, but two, also build that connection and that rapport. We have to do what we have to do when taking notes, but make a point to look up. Make it a point to pause. Make it a point to do the best you can do and be as trauma-informed as possible while getting your job done. We're running a little bit out of time. We get so excited that we over-talk about different things, so I'm going to keep going. Sometimes this can feel awkward. Saying things, or there's moments that something is shared with you that just seems so horrific that you don't know what to say. So here's a list of things that you can and should always say. You can say that I can only imagine how hard it is for you to talk about this. Remind them that it is not their fault. No matter what choices somebody made, they did not deserve to be raped. They did not deserve to be in a violent relationship, and they did not deserve to be denigrated. And so remind them that it is not their fault.
And there's nothing wrong with them, again. It is what happened to them.
Exactly. Also, survivors have often faced not just judgment, but people who do not believe them. And so you can say, I believe you. And in fact, you should say, I believe you, especially because part of our job to get the client's story is to ask follow-up questions. And so if a client shares something with you and your response is to be like, but I thought you said this happened, but the police report says this, but that doesn't match what you told me last time, all of a sudden the client is going to think, she doesn't believe me. When we've now learned and have talked about how trauma impacts memory, how memories can come at different times. Not only that, a lot of us have seen how police reports or other documents can be wrong. They're not infallible. And so if that's the situation you find yourself in, you can tell your client, I believe you. Now I have a couple follow-up questions because I want to make sure I have everything right. And ask your follow-up questions. And that way your follow-up questions do not seem to be a judgment on them. They understand the purpose of your follow-up questions, which ties into the next one of I am not judging you. And again, sometimes that feels awkward and it feels silly to say, but do not assume that because you are your attorney, you are your client's attorney, that they understand that means that you aren't judging them, right? We kind of presume, oh, well, I'm their advocate. They know I've got their back. It's okay, and you should reinforce that. Okay. So, looking at the time, I'm sorry, guys. I'm making sure I didn't skip.
We're good.
Okay,
right?
storytelling helps with memory. And again, we've talked about how trauma affects the client's memory. And so here are some different tips and techniques to use when getting your client's story, which we'll use to either write their affidavit, their declaration, connect them to resources, or whatever it is. Again, it goes back to explaining what you want to know and why. We've talked about redirecting, but it's also helpful in just setting the scene when you're asking questions to get the story. It has many benefits when you're working with your client. Ask open-ended questions. Now, it can be very difficult when talking to your client about some traumatic event, and it feels gross. We feel like we're turning into that perpetrator. And so sometimes we can catch ourselves trying to make it easy as possible for our clients. So then he raped you, right? Because then all they have to tell us is yes. But that doesn't do you any good as the attorney, nor does it allow your client to explain what happened to them. Nor is it consistent with what we've learned about trauma's effect on the memories. So to the best of your ability, ask open-ended questions. Ask questions to fill in those details. And then what happened? Can you tell me more? And how did this make you feel? Think back to the slide about the impact of trauma. Let that inspire you to ask questions that are open-ended to get more information to fill that in. Think of different ways that your client formulates and anchors your client to their story. Again, memories can be fractured. They can remember some instances more than others. And frankly, even without trauma, it's incredibly difficult to remember things that happened 20 years ago. And it is completely unfair that our immigration system requires an individual to do just that with excruciating detail, with dates that may not even be on the same calendar as ours. And so use different anchor points and figure out what anchor points might work when you're constructing your client's story. For example, what I mean by that is maybe your client has her memory jogged when you talk about the different places that she lived. If you're trying to figure out when some abuse started, you can ask them, was their child born at that point in time? Now you're narrowing the window to try to help create that chronological order that you need for the judge. Not only that, but if you have a birth certificate, you can pair a document with what your client's saying and truly be the detective when putting together their story so that you have corroborating evidence to show that you have a more or less chronological story. For some, it's housing. For some, it's birth of children. For some, it's time of year. But also, don't forget to be culturally competent and culturally humble, because if you're using seasons or the start of a school year, do not assume that they were the exact same for the client as they are for you. Other things to keep in mind. Now, as I've mentioned, as you can probably tell by the fact that I have increased the speed of which I'm talking, there's a lot of information that we can talk about and share. And so here's just some other considerations to keep in mind when you're working with your client. Details, documents, and inconsistencies are a real thing, and they can make or break a case. So consider trauma and consider all of that when structuring your timeline, your strategy, your story, and other documents. Keep in mind the gender of your client and your gender. Make sure, especially if you are a man, make sure your client even feels comfortable working with men. It's something to not forget.
At least address it.
Exactly. Confidentiality. Make sure you're explaining what is and is not confidential, not just once, but multiple times, so that your client understands what you can keep safe and what information is private and what you feel like what you have to share, whether legally or because of their case. This way you're not breaking that trust that has already been broken so many times. Not only that, but working with interpreters can be its own training in itself. So if you're working with interpreters, there's different things you have to consider, and even preparing your interpreter for what they're going to hear if they're going to hear something difficult. You don't want your interpreter to not know that they're about to hear a trauma story and then all of a sudden be traumatized themselves. So make sure you know that there's different things about working with interpreters that you should look into, and so that to make sure you're doing it in the most effective and efficient way possible.
We hope to address this in some future part of the series.
Exactly. So consider that a placeholder, because we'll talk about it more in different webinars to come. But lastly, there's a couple things I want you to remember. The effects of trauma, we saw pictures of the brain, they're supported by science. But being a trauma-informed attorney and using trauma-informed interviewing skills is an art. It takes practice, and we're not going to always get it right. And so it is something, it is an ability and a talent that should be practiced and should be developed. Be compassionate with yourselves. Again, it's not something we're always going to get right, but we're trying to do better and learn. So along with that, being trauma-informed is a choice. It is a choice that you as the attorney are making, that you as the advocate are making. And so make sure you make that choice and that you're intentional about incorporating trauma-informed practices into what you do. It goes to budgeting time. It goes to the way you communicate with your clients. Again, it's a beginning to end process. You are trying to be trauma-informed in the constraints of a very traumatic system. And so I know some of these tips you're hearing and you're thinking, yeah, but how do I do that? We understand that. The idea is when you can, given the already traumatic system that we're working in, be as trauma-informed as possible. And lastly, being trauma-informed doesn't mean not talking about trauma. It doesn't mean avoiding traumatic events and difficult subjects. It means addressing them and preparing your client to talk about them in a trauma-informed way.
But because of the nature of trauma, we also want to talk a little bit about trauma and you and its impact. Working with people who have had these horrific things happen to them that other people in your life can't even imagine. So we're going to talk about vicarious trauma or secondary trauma, as is known in the mental health field. But for anybody who works with and tries to help in any way people who have suffered in these ways, there is an experience of vicarious trauma that's going to happen. It's inevitable. Vicarious traumatization is the transformation of the helper's inner experience as a result of empathic engagement with survivor clients and their trauma story. Simply put, and this is the work by Roy Perlman and Catherine Sackvitney that's very, very central in the work of mental health field. When we open our hearts to hear someone's story of devastation or betrayal, our cherished beliefs are challenged, and we are forever changed. And this is particularly important for those of you who are working with traumatized people every single day, trying to help them as the rescuer.
So I know now we have about 5 minutes left and we want to leave a little time for questions. So Rosalie, I know they'll be getting these slides about what happens to the caregiver, and also the next slide that gives some tips and tricks about providing self-care for yourself and how to make sure you're taking care of yourself. But before we go to that, is there anything any last thoughts you want to say about?
No, just looking this, what you have to know is trauma is catchy and it's cumulative, and if we join them in the way that is necessary to do good work, we are going to be changed and altered also. We're going to suffer in some ways. We won't sleep. We'll have intrusive experiences that are theirs, that are ours. We're going to be overprotective. So there's more to know about this, and maybe at a later time we can talk about that too. But it's critical that you understand that balance and pleasure and play and beauty are part of self-care. So
and the one thing that I would want to say with this is feeling the effects of trauma, feeling the effects of burnout, does not mean you are not good enough as an attorney or not good enough as an advocate. Just like we're telling our clients that the impact trauma has on them is natural, that it's not what's wrong with them, it's what happened to them. Apply that compassion to yourself, because it is true too. Burnout doesn't mean you're weak. It does not mean you're not a good enough attorney or advocate. It means that you're working with trauma survivors and that you have to keep that in mind. So let's, I guess, quickly.
So this is the work of which we don't have on the slide here, but it's the work of Richard Mullica, who is the Harvard guy who works with refugees. And he talks about what the healing triangle is, and that's fostering justice. And that means that good work and empathy and self-care is the healing triangle. That if this were an overlay over the original traumatizing triangle, you would see what the nature of real help is and what the nature of helping ourselves is.
You interested in learning more and talking more about trauma? Well, here's a couple resources where you can start. So we have these there. Again, you're going to receive this PowerPoint presentation, so no need to jot them down. You're going to receive this, but we just wanted to point it out. And so any questions in the last couple minutes we have?
So,
One second. If you're on the phone and want to ask a question, give me one moment. Okay, if anyone's on the phone and would like to ask a question, you can unmute yourself.
We did get one great question, which is how can I tell if somebody is...
Sorry, I muted you.
There you go. Yeah. We did get one great question, which is how can you tell if someone is dissociating? Rosalie, do you want to start on
So
this?
yeah, I think there are many, many ways that people dissociate, right? So it could be they change in some way in the way they're relating to you. It could be that they look like they're not paying attention. It could be that their voice changes. It could be that they change the subject. It could be that they look away. But you'll see some subtle or not so subtle changes as they move from one feeling state to another, actually, and dissociate. They could be speaking about some horrific experience and almost with a smile on their face. And it's hard to even sit with the incoherent experience of them explaining in this rather kind of ordinary, non-emotional way, a story that you think otherwise would be just devastating and very emotional. But that's, the only way they can say it. So there's lots of ways people can look away, they can, in avoidance, but it's not conscious.
So one thing that I've noticed clients doing is also breathing pickup. They start breathing faster, and again, you might see their eye movement. They look at different places, which is a good reminder of something that I meant to say and didn't say. One tip that can be very helpful is just to take a moment to breathe with your client. It doesn't always have to be a break where you get up and walk away. Sometimes when you see your client start to look away, start to breathe fast, start to talk faster, cry, not cry, it's an opportunity to say, I know this is incredibly hard to share. Thank you for sharing that with me. Why don't we take a couple breaths together? Breathe in, breathe out. And by doing that, you're actually giving them an opportunity to pause, recenter, remind them that they are safe now, and keep it from progressing to a point where they're not able to work with you anymore.
But this whole notion of both when they get hyperaroused, for example, and they're breathing rapidly, that's the breathing that, or they stop breathing. When we're in the fight, flight, freeze, surrender, alarm center of the brain, we literally don't move, don't breathe, so that the predator doesn't get us. This is true for all mammals. So the long, deep breaths, and you want to encourage them to expand the breath so that they can get back to the safe brain in the room with you, right? Also, when they're dissociating, try to let them think about, okay, how does it feel? How does the chair feel? Put your feet on the floor. You want to attach them again in the present to all of their senses. What is the room? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Is it just right? What, give them some water so that they can feel some taste. Every one of their senses to ground them back in the present.
Something that I found is also very helpful is that I keep stress balls in my office. And it allows my client to hold something if she needs to while talking about her story and have something in her hand. So stress balls, something little, might work for your client as well to keep them from dissociating if they're dissociating or help bring them back. Another question that we got, before I say that, I want to put a pin holder. We did not talk about affect at all, or how a client might cry very easily or not cry at all. That is something that we are going to address in one of our later webinars, especially when preparing your client to testify on the stand, how the trauma has impacted that, and how you can use a mental health professional to frame how that is just part of trauma. But as an advocate or as an attorney, it's important to just know that a client might present because of trauma with very different affects, and it is a normal thing that is part of trauma.
Because it's central. Remember, regulating one's emotions is the central problem and the central behavior that you're going to see.
So Rosalie, another question we got is, how do I get my client to see a therapist?
Well, this is complicated, isn't it? Because one, they have to be able to access resources financially or even public health. Do they have a gold card or here in Houston, it's a gold card. Eligibility for public service. Every state is different. Are there cultural beliefs that really don't allow them to even think that talking to another person, particularly one of not in their own culture, about their feelings and their experience may be so out of their cultural frame. So we want to help them understand what we understand about trauma and how talking to someone who knows and understands can be helpful. And we have studies to prove this, but there are many barriers to care. And but finding resources for them is one of them. And
yeah, something that I've found to be very helpful as well when I have clients that are hesitant to going to counseling or therapy is explaining how that might help them in their case. So either that means that you can get a counseling letter that you'll include, or it is explaining the fact that working on your case and sharing their story is very hard, and they're going to have to do that in front of a judge who's going to make a decision. And so by working with a counselor, it can be part of the preparation of being in a place where they can do that as effectively and efficiently as possible, right? You're building almost the support team, and you're explaining how a counselor or therapist can fit into that support team that your client has. And so especially when there's such a stigma against mental health, explaining that it has a tangible legal benefit can help break through that stigma.
yeah, it's critical. Yeah.
And so, we got a comment about sometimes you've given the information, you've tried to make your client as comfortable as possible, but they are just not comfortable in sharing about and speaking about their trauma. And that's okay. We want to be the best advocate we can be. We want to include every piece of detail that we think will be, really impactful for their case. And at the end of the day, it's not our story, and it's not our choice all the time. And so one of the things as the attorney that you can think about is how to even just frame that in their declaration, right? Something that you can include is, so much has happened to me and it hurts and it's hard to share, right? Just letting the judge or the adjudicator know and helping the client just to vocalize that of how bad they feel when they have to talk about their story helps explain why maybe they're not sharing everything that happened with them at the time. Obviously, it'd be stronger if we could talk about it, but even pointing out that they feel so traumatized by what was done to them and what they've experienced that they can't talk about it, at least frames that for the adjudicator.
And we have to help them understand that they can do it. For example, the forensic evaluations, there is some research on, even as it's like getting a root canal. We don't do therapy this way. We don't ask people these kinds of intense questions up front when you don't know them yet. In real therapy, this is a progression over time in a stage-based understanding of recovery. However, we find that people get better just having told the story in this horrific way, even with the forensics. They feel better, they feel relief. So when a person has trouble saying, I can't speak about it, we want to help them, one, do some psychoeducation. This is why it's hard to talk about. Of course it's hard to talk about, but I'm here to help you do this in a way that you can tolerate. So,
and also when you're explaining why they need to talk about something, if they make the choice to not talk about it, then that is still their choice. And you help empower somebody to make choice and have ownership over their own story. So again, even just by giving an explanation, you've helped to foster choice. And I think, Rosalie, you've made a great point about the fact that it is a process. And sometimes we forget, especially when we're working with our clients for years, that we, at the end of the day, are just involved in their life in a small chapter of their story. And so even if they're not comfortable talking about it today, even if they're not comfortable going to seek counseling or talk to a therapist today, you might have planted the seed for them to get the help they need when the chapter that you have with your client has closed. But that seed, that moment, that conversation that you happened has set them up for a road of healing that we might not ever know about, but still was vitally important. So we received another question. Are the effects worse if they happen when you are a child?
generally worse. I mean, okay, trauma and severity is worse depending on the severity of the trauma, the chronicity of the trauma, and the developmental age that it took place. So of course, if you have chronic trauma over your childhood, it's going to affect a person, as all of our histories affect us, but particularly because of these developmental stages, there are all kinds of issues of mastery developmentally that have to happen that can't happen. Certain developmental tasks, particularly with attachment, when it's a caregiver. So of course it's worse when they're children, and that is part of what makes them the sitting duck for further victimization in their adult life. I don't know that this is a very complicated question, complicated answer, but yes.
So not only that, but as the attorney, you're framing the whole story of your client, right? So the trauma that occurred to them when they were a child might have impacted and set the stage, so to speak, for the trauma that is central to their case, right? It might not be technically relevant for their case that they were abused as a child, but that abuse, that impact that trauma had on them at such a young age, at a developmental age, helps set the scene and explain all the choices and the dominoes that happened afterwards.
And that's what a good forensic will help you understand too. A good forensic includes a psychosocial history, even beyond what the nature of the problem for the case is, the relationship or whatever happened to them that's related to the case. But it helps understand that vulnerability, if that's part of it. So, I think we're about ready to close, and I just wanted to kind of close with some hope that you've gotten something out of this training, and that we hope that you'll continue with the series, because we want it to be a real broad spectrum understanding of what trauma-informed lawyering is for any lawyers out there who are trying to do really good work and not overwhelm themselves or their clients.
So with that, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for your time and the incredible work that you're doing to support survivors of violence. And we'll hope to see you again in the future in one of the next webinar series.
Take care now. Bye-bye.